Welcome everyone. My name is Johannes Niederhauser, for those of you who don't know. I have a PhD in philosophy and I'm what I refer to as a free scholar. That means I don't pursue an academic career. I wrote a PhD on Heidegger at Warwick University. And today actually this video lecture is on Heidegger, on a important question but also an old question, an old allegation. It's about Dasein and subjectivity, Dasein und Subjekt and subjectivism. So I'll switch sometimes back also into the German. I'll be reading from the German version of Sein und Zeit also for this lecture. So, but before I begin, as always, if you'd like to support my work in any way, you'll find several links down below in the description of the video to do so. It's highly appreciated. And also if you'd like to study more intensely, you'll find links to courses on Heidegger that I teach with live cohorts, and sometimes also just on your own time you can sign up and get additional very long, very intense lectures on specific topics in Heidegger and other philosophers. So that's how I make my living. I think it's probably, to anyone who's remotely interested in Heidegger, obvious and known that he profoundly critiques subjectivism. And that begins very early on, even before Being and Time. And what Heidegger's project is after his entire thinking path is he's after the transformation of the human being out of the decayed gestalt of the enclosed subject towards Dasein, or Dasein with a hyphen, or later on towards being mortal. The human being as mortal being cast into the four regions of the world, so the so-called Geviert. Now, ever since the publication of Being and Time, and probably most prominently so within the case of Sartre, there was a confusion with Dasein with the subject. And up until this day, you can get questions that will attempt to say that, but there is still a subject in Being and Time, right? There must be. And I'm not trying to make some sort of a scholarly, theoretical argument here and trying to show why that's wrong and how far we can, in terms of argument, save Heidegger. This is not some self-serving academic exercise where you're just trying to prove something. That's got nothing to do with thinking. And by the way, one of the best ways to stop yourself from coming into thinking is probably studying philosophy at this point at university. That's probably the surest way of prohibiting yourself to come into thinking. You'll learn how to argue and all of that nonsense, but no. So the question is that Heidegger addresses is not arbitrary. Right? And he speaks of Dasein, etc., and why he critiques the subject and subjectivism and subjectivity itself also is there's a reason why, as it has run its course, and Heidegger begins to see this, and he begins to see and realize that there is something ontologically unfounded about subjectivity and subjectivism hence also. And this unfoundedness, though, is itself, as it were, in a certain weird sense, perhaps grounded, if you could say so, in Dasein and being in the world. So a typical, and by the way, Sartre misunderstood Dasein completely, right? He thought that it's just another version of the subject, feeling anxious in the world and worried whether people will come to meet them for coffee or something. So, or whether they will show up or not. So, For Heidegger, yes, that much is true. We can say that we can name Descartes, or we can name the onset of subjectivity Cartesian. It's not to say that Descartes invents it, or there's no invention at all, but that this is the moment that this is birth, but this is the moment where perhaps Descartes is the midwife to bring this to life, to bring this into, to articulate the egoity of the subject. Now, what is the subject? The subject for Heidegger is hypokeimenon. He very, very strictly from early on in Being and Time, I'm going to that passage in a second, relates the subject to not any really, he does, but not primarily or initially to any theory of subjectivity or so. But no, it's just very strictly, where does the term come from? What is its genealogy, if you like? But more than just its genealogy, what are the ramifications of its meaning, and how does it change, and why is it the human being that becomes the hypokeimenon, that which as substratum underlies all that is insofar that it is? And how at all is the so-called much bemoaned subject-object dichotomy possible at all? And to give away the answer, it's possible only on the ground of Dasein. So, and of course with the subject-object dichotomy, what you also arrive at to a certain degree, is not necessarily, but it's one of the consequences of it, not the only one, but one of them, is that you now have in an intense mathematicization of the world also. And an attempt to bridge the gap between subject and object, between subject and world, as it were, through mathematical apparatus, physical apparatus, or mathematical models, so that we can have still access to it. It's a problem of the categories as well that we could mention here, but I won't go into this here for now. There are more videos on this, and I also have a course on German idealism if you're interested in this issue that you can sign up for. So the old allegation is, and it keeps coming back for specific reasons, and I say this again, this is not to be self-serving within, to say, oh no, but Heidegger doesn't really have a subject. No. The reason why Heidegger has to begin to think in terms of Dasein is because the subject itself has already run its course. It's built on quicksand, as it were. But the reason why this keeps coming back, this imagination, this Vorstellung, this representation of any kind of a shadow or subject, is precisely because of this. And this is maybe, listen, and maybe we can learn something on the distinction, but also how they come together between thinking and representation and imagination. So we want to hold on to something that's representational, right? We have, the subject has the faculty of perceiving. That's very representational speech and a way of representing what is and what is not. So, and also, by the way, to be able to say I, which is what Dasein can say, and to be in a each mein or je Meinigkeit in German, this is each my situation or so, that's not subjectivity. We have to be very careful. Subjectivity is something very, very specific. Subjectivity is the ground, is the human being as ground of everything that is, insofar that it is as object standing in opposition to the human being, and the human being ultimately divided from the world. And so this isn't to say, again, to say that we can just replace the word Dasein with subject, and we're almost saying the same thing, because the subject operates within, according to Heidegger, operates within an epistemology that is predicated on correspondence truth and on the subject-object dichotomy as well. So, and we have to then also discuss the inner and the outer, and we'll do this in a second. But let me first go to page 14 in the German version of Sein und Zeit. So this is from the Max Niemeyer Verlag in Tübingen. Heidegger says here, der ontisch-ontologische Vorrang des Daseins wurde schon früh gesehen. The ontic-ontological primacy of Dasein was seen early. And then he quotes Aristotle, and he quotes the from the Peritheps Psyches, he quotes from De Anima. Aristotle, Herr Psyche ta und ta pos estin. So, the soul of the human being, not the Christian soul, by the way, just very important. The soul of the human being, the being of the human being, is, in some sense, pos in Greek, beings, is that which is, insofar that it is. The soul, as Heidegger then continues here himself, going beyond the dictum from Aristotle, that makes that is, as it were, the being of the human being, discovers, very important, in its ways of being, which are aesthesis kai noesis in Greek, everything that is insofar that it is, insofar, and he says literally, in its that being and in its so being. So it's the being of the human being that lets take into discovery and consideration, take into care, which is Heidegger says, die Sorge ist das Sein des Daseins. Now, and then we won't go into Aquinas and Parmenides here, but he says here at the end that this is something that comes to the fore here, which is ontologically not solved, ontologically not clear, ontologically not yet fully established, and at the same time, it's not to be understood here as a bad kind of subjectivization of the whole of beings. So this, I think, is important to understand, that what Heidegger is doing in the introduction of Being and Time, paragraph 4, is to show, with reference to Aristotle, that this thought, even though not radicalized ontologically, had arisen at the very beginning of philosophy also. Namely, that it is the soul, or let's say the being of the human being, and also the human being for whom being itself is an issue, and his or her own being is an issue. This, taking into care and consideration, is what grounds the human being in the world. And the world itself is not a receptacle or so, but is the horizon against which beings appear as meaningful to us. So the difference with, the radical difference then with a subject in a Cartesian sense, is that what is here taken into consideration, and with truth reduced to certainty, is ego sum certum est. Ego sum ego existo certum est. I am, I exist, this is certain, this is true. Going so far as saying that there might be a demon out there. So, and also, I mentioned this in passing just a couple of minutes ago. Listen what Heidegger says. He talks about ways of being when he speaks about aesthesis kai noein, which means to, let's say, to perceive and also to think or to reason. He doesn't speak of faculties. And that's crucial. Something else that comes up from, and this is, by the way, the struggle of German idealism in a nutshell, is to struggle against the reification of the subject. They don't come out of the subject or subjectivity. They don't see it yet. So I'm not saying I had to stop myself there, speaking too scholarly. It's not about a failure or so, but they're still entrapped within it. They couldn't yet see the beyond scope that Heidegger then has to see and also has to develop, because what Heidegger is after is, just like Kant and Fichte and Hegel, is to overcome the reification of the human being. As, for example, a subject that contains within itself certain faculties. So this is not so. These are ways of being. Now, Heidegger. Then let's move briefly to Seite 46, page 46. So this is important. This is in line with what I was just pointing out. If you're reading along in a translation or so, this is in paragraph 10, where Heidegger very importantly says how that the analysis and the analytic of Dasein is different from anthropology, psychology, and biology. By the way, just maybe to mention this also very briefly, what's the project of being in time? Fundamental ontology. To ground the sciences in a sound ontology of Dasein, of in the world being, not being in the world, that's a bad translation, in the world being, right? Because in the world being is where Dasein is the grounding of a genuine ontology that is fundamental, so that the other ontologies, for example biology, can disclose beings insofar as they are in a true manner, without trying exactly what happens through subjectivism, namely trying to get back to beings through computer simulations and models and graphs and everything else that's going on in the world, and which is becoming obvious to anyone who's not completely gone, and they don't matter anyway. So again, in page 46, he says that he says, jede Idee von Subjekt macht noch, falls sie nicht durch eine vorgängige ontologische Grundbestimmung geläutert ist, den Ansatz des Subjektum in Griechisch Hypokemenon ontologisch mit. Ne? Obwohl man dann diese Seelensubstanz oder die Verdinglichung des Bewusstseins dann eben abwehren will. So what Heidegger says here, every idea of the subject still continues because they fail to see this fundamental ontological problem and radicalization that's necessary through Dasein. They still are, even if just at the root, they are still within the subjectum as hypokemenon. That is to say, as the ground of everything that is as an object. And Heidegger radicalizes this further in his essay, The Age of the World Picture. So, because what happens then also, of course, is that there's a certain objectivization or reification of the self and of the subject. Das Subjekt muss dann auch vergegenständlicht werden. Und diese Vergegenständlichung macht es unmöglich, das Dasein im Vollzug zu denken. This objectification, reification make it impossible to think Dasein and in the world being. Right, so did you hear the difference? In the world being in the world. Right? In the world being, you can hear the activity, right, if you like, the Vollzug, the way in which it unfolds and acts itself or so. I mean, this is a bad Vollziehen. I still don't have a word for this in English. There's a pull. It's pulling itself out of itself and pulling into the world. But being in the world is just, you're placed in a receptacle called world. It's a terrible translation, because in the world, being triggers the representation not at all. Being in the world triggers the representation immediately. Oh yeah, being in the world, of course. Yeah, I'm in the world. I'm immersed in the world, playing guitar, blah blah blah. All this nonsense from the Dreyfusians and all of this. It's got nothing to do with it. We're dealing with very serious questions here of what it means to be human, and not how you use a hammer. So, so it's about the ways of being. Even perceiving is a way of being. So let me move on to page 59 here, And if there's nothing else that I'd like to add here, maybe there's always something, but it must rest. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think this is the page where there are many other pages, but this is one of the pages where in Heidegger, in a single paragraph, completely, destroys and destructs. I don't mean, it destructs in a good sense the so-called Kentness Problem, the problem of the modern problem of epistemology. Which is the following. So he points out that the subject-object relationship, not just dichotomy, but also relationship, is presupposed, and to add something to Heidegger, which I don't think he points out, is that also the subject-object dichotomy, of course, is presupposed. So this is presupposed, and Heidegger here then really destructs the modern problem of epistemology, the modern Kentness Problem, in showing that this is ontologically possible precisely only because of the presupposition of the subject-object relationship, which itself rests on or is an unclarified presupposition. And a presupposition that itself cannot be reined in, and itself is also, and as I said before, is built on quicksand. We're back with the Münchhausen problem here. Baron of Münchhausen supposedly pulled himself out of the swamp. And at the same time, of course, modern epistemology is completely predicated on truth as correspondence. So that what the subject represents corresponds to the object out there in some way. And you can get all kinds of confusing, absolutely dead ends. This is what keeps academia going and in bread and butter. You can produce a lot of papers if you do that, if you play that epistemological game, because it's endless. It's endless precisely because there's no there. There's no ground. It just collapses. So, again, here is also where Heidegger points out that subject and object are not equivalent or not identical with Dasein and world. What we would have to say is that everything, it's all Dasein. It's always been Dasein. It's just now, with Heidegger, been named as Dasein. It was waiting for that word to come, for this openness of being, so that what was already flickering, coming up, bubbling up with Aristotle, for example, is now really coming to the fore, being articulated as that which brings, sort of grounds the human being in world, a problem that Heidegger says has not been addressed properly before. So even recognizing or recognition, cognition, etc., for Heidegger is again not a faculty, but is a mode of in the world being. But again, it's not a faculty or a capacity of the soul bag of the subject. The subject itself is only possible on the ground of a misguidedness, a misguiding, let's say misguiding, a misguiding around or away from in the world being. So, and maybe the most important one, so again, Dasein is not placed in the world, which is a receptacle. That's subjective representationalism. Dasein is pushed, or Dasein insofar as it is in the world being. And in the world being does not mean to be a reified thing that just stands there waiting to have something thrown at it. No, it's always already only in a ecstatically temporal being towards death, which shows Dasein its possibilities on which it can or cannot act. Ultimately, Dasein has, with death, a possibility that gives it nothing to actualize. And so here we have now the question of being outside and being within, and the inner being, etc., etc. And just in a few minutes, maybe this is sometimes confusing what's being said here, where Heidegger does go into the following. Sorry, let me just make sure I have the right one. Yeah. Yeah. Heidegger says that this being outside, but we have to be careful here. So the sentence I'm after is, und das bestimmende sich aufhalten bei dem zu erkennenden Seienden ist nicht etwa ein Verlassen der inneren Sphäre, sondern auch in diesem Draußensein beim Gegenstand ist das Dasein im recht verstandenen Sinne drin. Das heißt, es selbst ist es als in der Welt sein, das er kennt. Yeah? So, that's to say, what is in a proper sense understood, the being outside with, being with, and we have to be careful, this is only page 62. The book, of course, is an unfolding, developmental. Heidegger is, breaking down all the language, and the book really begins with section 2. So Heidegger does not talk about objects, etc., but this being with and being outside. Heidegger actually says, that Dasein is always already outside of itself in a certain sense, and being with others, being with things, being engaged with, etc., always concerned already with the next issue or question, etc. So also, though, this being within is not to say that it's encapsulated within the shell of a subject from which it's almost impossible, if it weren't for God, to quote Descartes, which upholds this law of referentiality, as it were. So Heidegger, Dasein is within, and by the way, this is only page 62, and we won't go much further tonight, but it's within insofar as Dasein is always in the world being. That is, and that in the world being is not a fact, right? It's a task. It's something that Dasein, not something, but it's what Dasein enacts. So this being within means that there is no outside to the world which is not Dasein, but Dasein as in the world being is so profoundly related to the world that which is the horizon against which beings appear as meaningful. But again, Dasein itself is thrown, it doesn't make itself, and also it's very important to see that Dasein does not ever become the ground of objectivity or the ground of beings, which is what Heidegger would mean by subjectivization. That's not what Dasein becomes, but it is, according to Dasein, or it is for Dasein, that beings are meaningful in that specific human peculiar way. And I'll leave it at that. I hope that this gives some hints at a way of seeing perhaps what's going on here. But I think perhaps what's most important is to begin to see the distinction, the difference between thinking and Vorstellung, representation and imagination. The latter two very quickly interfere. And what happens in Heidegger, more importantly even also, to say this again, is that something is here bubbling up. Something is becoming visible and necessary. Necessary to be dealt with in a certain way, namely Dasein, which had already, was spitting, as it were, but by the failure of thought to articulate Dasein, ended up in the detour of subjectivity, which really has encapsulated the human being within a prison, but also means that the human being is inflated to deeming himself the ground of everything that is, insofar that it is. So thank you very much indeed, and I hope this was helpful. Thank you.